Okay, this lecture is on personality. After hearing this lecture, you should be able to describe the big five personality traits that comprise the five-factor model of personality. You should be able to describe how the facet approach extends broad personality traits. You should know examples of models and traits beyond the five-factor model, and then be able to explain a critique of the personality trait concept. So here's an overview of topics. We're going to start with an introduction to personality traits. So personality is described as the characteristic ways people differ from each other. For example, some people are talkative while other people are quiet. Some people are active while other people are kind of lazy or couch potatoes. Some people worry a lot while other people are very calm and almost never seem to worry. So each time we use words like talkative, quiet, active, or anxious to describe somebody, we're talking about personality. And it's a personality psychologist's job to try to figure out these differences between people. So personality psychologists contend that personality traits are the best indicators of the differences between people. According to trait psychologists, there are a limited number of basic dimensions, which we call traits, on which people differ, such as extroversion or agreeableness. And so each person falls within a certain range on that particular trait, either at the high end or the low end or somewhere in between. An important feature of personality traits is that they reflect a continuum rather than distinct personality types. So this is referred to as a continuous distribution. And this is the idea that characteristics can go from low to high with all different intermediate values in between that are possible. So a person does not simply have a trait or not have it, but the idea is that we can possess a varying amount of different traits. So when we talk about somebody who we consider to be an extrovert, we're really talking about somebody that scores very high in the trait extroversion. And when we're talking about somebody who is an introvert, we're talking about somebody that would score very low in the trait of extroversion. As you can see from this picture, the idea is that most people score somewhere in the medium or moderate range. That is, most people have a medium amount of extroversion, with only a few people, the very extreme extroverts, scoring very high, and fewer people, that is, people that you would consider very extreme introverts, scoring very low. So personality traits are conceived of as a continuum. There are three criteria that characterize personality traits, which is consistency, stability, and individual differences. So consistency can be thought of like this. So for a quality to be considered a personality trait, the behaviors associated with the trait need to be consistent across situations. So for example, somebody is considered a talkative person if they tend to be talkative at home as well as at work, in public as well as in private. The second criteria would have to do with stability. So individuals with a trait are somewhat stable over time in the behaviors related to that trait. So for example, somebody that's active at age 30 will also likely be active at age 40 and also at age 50. So the behaviors are stable. And then the third criterion refers to individual differences. So personality traits are a way of distinguishing how people differ from one another. So in order to be considered a trait, it needs to distinguish one person from another. So, for example, using speech would not be a personality trait, and neither is walking on 2 feet. That's because virtually all people do these activities, speaking and walking. So that wouldn't fit the criteria for being a trait because it doesn't really classify or differentiate one person from another. However, people do differ on how frequently they talk, and they do differ on how active they are. Therefore, personality traits such as talkativeness and activity level do exist. One of the primary challenges for psychologists in identifying personality traits has been coming up with suitable descriptors of personality. For many decades, scientists contributed hundreds of attributes to the list of traits. And so this resulted in hundreds and hundreds of adjectives that could potentially qualify as descriptors of personality, making describing personality a very convoluted classification process. Eventually, it became clear that simplifying the very long list of personality descriptors was a necessity, and this gave rise to something called the 5-factor model of personality. In order to develop the 5-factor model of personality, psychologists took all the personality descriptors that they could find in the dictionary. This was a very long list. It started out being approximately 18,000 words to begin with. The reason that they did this is their approach was guided by something called the lexical hypothesis. The lexical hypothesis states that all important personality characteristics should be reflected in the language that we use to describe other people. Therefore, if we want to know which personality traits are the most important, we can look to the language that people use to describe themselves as others. So in starting with this very, very big list of words, psychologists then used statistical techniques called factor analysis to determine which words went together. So in other words, if everyone who said that they were friendly also said that they were sociable, this suggested to personality psychologists that they would only need a single trait that would differentiate people on these characteristics. Okay? So this approach gave rise to the 5-factor model. Ultimately, the lexical approach showed that many of the personality descriptors found in the dictionary do indeed overlap. That is, many of the words that we use to describe people end up being synonyms. For instance, friendly, sociable, and gregarious are all words that basically mean enjoying the company of others. Because sociable people tend to be friendly, and friendly people tend to be gregarious, we can summarize this personality dimension with a single term. Therefore, we say that somebody who is sociable, friendly, and gregarious would typically be described as extroverted. Since we know that a person is an extrovert, we can assume that this person is sociable, friendly, and gregarious. So ultimately, these statistical methods helped to determine that only a small number of dimensions underlie the diversity of words that we use to describe each other. And so the most widely accepted personality classification system to emerge from this lexical approach was the Big Five, or the 5-factor model. The Big Five comprises 5 major traits. And a helpful way to remember these Big Five traits is by using the acronym OCEAN, which stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Openness is defined as the tendency to appreciate new ideas, art, values, feelings, and behaviors. An individual that scores high in openness enjoys seeing people with new types of haircut or maybe a tattoo, would be described as curious, imaginative, and untraditional. A person who scores lower in openness might not prefer to be exposed to new ideas, would have narrow interest, would not be very creative or artistic. Conscientiousness is the tendency to be careful, on time for appointments, to follow rules, and to be hardworking. Somebody who scores high in conscientiousness would rarely be late for an appointment. They tend to be organized, hardworking, neat. They tend to persevere. They're punctual and self-disciplined. Alternatively, somebody who scores low in conscientiousness may prefer kind of spur of the moment activities versus planning, might be somewhat unreliable, might be careless, or somewhat lazy. They might also be hedonistic, that is, seeking pleasure versus doing one's responsibilities. Extroversion is the tendency to be talkative, sociable, enjoy other people, and extroverts also have a tendency to have a dominant style. People who are high in extroversion might be the life of the party, but those that are low in extroversion might prefer a quiet night or reading in bed, and might be perceived at some times to be rather unenthusiastic. So we often think of people as low in extroversion as introverts. Agreeableness is the tendency to agree and go along with others rather than to assert one's own opinion and choices. An agreeable person will agree with others about their political opinions and social values. They're often described as good-natured, forgiving, overly trusting, and helpful. An individual low in agreeableness might quickly and confidently assert their own rights and opinions, but be irritable, manipulative, uncooperative, and sometimes rude. Neuroticism is a tendency to frequently experience negative emotions, such as anger, worry, sadness, as well as being interpersonally sensitive. Somebody who's neurotic might constantly worry about the little things, be insecure, or feel inadequate at times. People who are low in neuroticism, they don't get irritated by small annoyances. They're able to remain calm. They're often cool-headed and unemotional, hardy, secure, and often self-satisfied. So a great way to think about these big five traits is to think about examples of behaviors for people that score low and high, much like the descriptions that I just gave previously. So how does it feel to be told that your entire personality can be summarized with scores on just 5 personality traits? Do you think that these 5 traits capture the complexity of your own and other people's patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors? Most people probably say no, that they don't think that 5 traits or dimensions is quite enough. So for instance, you might know people who are warm and friendly, and they find it easy to talk to strangers at a party, but yet they'd be terrified to have to perform in front of others on a stage or to have to speak to a large group of people. So what this tells us is that there's different ways of being extroverted. And this shows us that there's value in considering more specific or what are called lower level units of personality than these broader big 5 traits. The more specific lower levels of personality are often called facets. It's important to know that although personality researchers generally agree about the value of the big 5 traits as a way to summarize a person's personality, there's no widely accepted list of facets that should be studied. Okay, so while personality psychologists agree on the big five, they don't necessarily agree on the lower level units of personality within each of the big five factors. That being said, on the next several slides, I'm going to present several facets within each of the big five traits that some researchers have come up with. So these facets reflect just some of the possibilities among many, but it should give you an idea of some of the facets that make up each of the traits of the five-factor model. So for instance, the facets that comprise openness are or include being fantasy prone, being open to feelings, being open to diverse behaviors, being open to new and different ideas, and being open to various values and beliefs. Some of the facets that comprise conscientiousness would include being competent, orderly, dutiful, achievement-oriented, self-disciplined, and deliberate. And again, you can think of people scoring high or low or in the middle on any one of these facets. Extroversion would include the facets of being gregarious, warm, assertive, active, excitement-seeking, and having positive emotionality. Agreeableness consists of the facets of being straightforward, altruistic, compliant, trusting, modest, and tender-minded. And finally, neuroticism consists of the facets of being anxious, angry, depressed, self-conscious, impulsive, and vulnerable. Facets can be useful because they provide more specific descriptions of what a person is like. A precise profile of facet scores not only provides a better description of a person, but it would allow us to predict how somebody would do in a variety of different jobs, or how successful they would be in different domains in life. Returning to the job example, understanding a person's precise profile of facet scores, particularly on extroversion and conscientiousness, might help us predict whether that person would be well suited for a job that requires public speaking versus a job that involves one-on-one customer interactions. It should still be noted, though, that because different facets within a broad global trait like extroversion tend to go together, the broad trait still often does provide a useful summary of what a person is like. Okay, so that is the idea that facets within a dimension tend to correlate. That is, those who score higher on gregariousness often will score higher on assertiveness, because those are both facets within the broad dimension of extroversion. Okay, so there's often a relationship or a correlation between people's scores, but not always. So when we really want to know a person, facet scores add to our knowledge in important ways. But again, it should be noted that there's no widely accepted list of facets. And the ones that I've presented here just reflects one possible list of facets out of many. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some personality traits beyond the five-factor model. Despite the popularity of the five-factor model, it's certainly not the only one that exists. And some psychologists suggest that there are more than 5 major traits, while some people believe that there's even fewer. So personality psychologist Hans Eyck, proposed one of the first comprehensive models. He suggested that extroversion and neuroticism were the most important dimensions to consider, and that by looking at these two major traits, we could account for many of the differences that we see between people in their personality. So, for instance, he said that a neurotic introvert is somebody that would be shy and nervous. But somebody who is a stable introvert, that is low on neuroticism and also low in extroversion, so they're a stable introvert, they might avoid social situations and prefer to be alone, but not really have any anxiety or emotion. So Hans Eyck attempted to link these two dimensions to people's underlying differences in their physiology or biology. He hypothesized, for example, that introverts experienced too much sensory stimulation from the environment, and there was a biological basis for that. And because they would be overly stimulated by environments, that made them seek out quiet settings. Okay, so that there was a biological basis for these traits. A second model to consider beyond the Big Five is the hexaco model. So this is a revision of the Big Five, which is very similar, but it suggests slightly different versions of some of these traits, and it includes an additional trait that the people that came up with the hexaco model thought was omitted from the 5-factor model, and this is the dimension of honesty and humility. So people that score high in this trait are sincere, fair, and modest, whereas people that score low in this trait are manipulative and self-centered, or might be described as narcissistic. Okay, there we are. Okay. The other dimensions are very similar. So the emotion dimension is similar to neuroticism, and then we see extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. So what you can see is that we have the same Big Five dimensions, only neuroticism is relabeled as emotion, and then we have the addition of the honesty and humility dimension. So the hexaco model is just a slight variation on the Big Five, and the primary difference is that the honesty humility dimension has been added as a 6th dimension of personality. Okay, going outside of these big models with these broader dimensions, there's quite a few number of personality traits that are important in understanding behavior. So there's still many debates on the exact number and composition of traits, but researchers have suggested that there's other traits that capture interesting aspects of our behavior as well, such as Machiavellianism, need for achievement, need for cognition, authoritarianism, narcissism, self-esteem, optimism, and alexithymia. Machiavellianism is named after the famous political philosopher Machiavelli, and this trait refers to people who manipulate the behavior of others. People that score high in this trait are often interested in money and power and pragmatically use other people in achieving these ends. Need for achievement refers to the need for achievement and wanting to accomplish a lot and set high standards of excellence. Need for cognition. So people that score high in need for cognition find it rewarding to understand things. They're willing to use considerable cognitive effort to do so. People that score high in need for cognition enjoy learning and trying to understand new things. The trait of authoritarianism refers to having a preference for strict social hierarchies. People that score high in authoritarianism are obedient to those above them in the hierarchy, including their leaders, and they also expect complete obedience from people below them in the hierarchy, their subordinates. People that score high in authoritarianism believe in rigid adherence to rules, and people that score high in this personality are very uncomfortable with uncertainty. Narcissism refers to being in love with oneself. So the narcissistic personality has self-love that is so strong that it results in high levels of vanity, conceit, and selfishness. People that are narcissistic often have difficulties feeling empathy towards others. Self-esteem refers to the general tendency to evaluate oneself positively. People that score high in self-esteem would agree with the statement that they believe that they are a person of worth. Not necessarily that they're better than others, only that they are a person of worth. Optimism refers to the tendency to expect positive outcomes in the future. People who are optimistic expect good things to happen to themselves, and indeed often have more positive outcomes, perhaps because they work harder to achieve them. And finally, alexithymia is the inability to recognize and label emotions in oneself. People that score high in this trait also have a difficult time recognizing emotions in others and have difficulties in relationships. So these are just a few of some of the many personality traits that psychologists have found interesting to study. And while there are others, these are some of the more important ones that psychologists have devoted their attention to. All right, finally, we're going to talk about a critique of personality traits, which has become known as the person-situation debate. So, even though a lot of what you've heard so far perhaps seems pretty obvious in terms of our impressions of ourselves and the people around us, we should ask how deeply we would believe in personality if we take a closer look. That is, what if everything I've talked about so far is incorrect? What if our belief in personality traits was just an illusion and people are not actually consistent in their behaviors from one situation to the next? It was this notion that shook the foundation of personality psychology in the late 1960s when Walter Mischel published a book called Personality and Assessment. In it, Mischel suggested that if one looks closely at people's behaviors across many different situations, they're often not very consistent. So, as just one example, and one that he wrote about in the book, what he found is that kids in school who cheat on a test or in an exam might actually follow all the rules in a game on the playground, or be children that never lie to their parents. So what he thought was that in fact, there's situational factors that might be the primary determinant of behavior, and that these broad personality traits, like the honesty, humility dimension, might be an illusion. So the debate that followed from the publication of the book was called the person-situation debate because it pitted personality against situational factors as determinants of behavior. The critique from situationists is that people overestimate the extent to which personality traits are consistent across situations. So, because of this debate, many psychologists began to focus on alternatives to the trait perspective, such as how people react to specific situations. So for instance, when studying the personality trait of honesty, they thought that some people or some children might be especially likely to cheat on a test when the risk of being caught is low and when rewards are high. However, other children might be motivated by the risk involved in cheating and may even do so even when the rewards are not very high for cheating. Thus, the behavior results from a child's unique evaluation of the risks and rewards in the situation combined with his or her own abilities and values. So from this perspective, specific behaviors are a result of the interaction between very specific features of a particular situation, a person's unique way of perceiving that situation, and his or her ability for dealing with a situation. So after many years of debate, psychologists that were situationists, that is, those that believed primarily in the power of the situation, now generally agree that both situations and personality factors determine behavior. In fact, research has shown that on average, the effect of the situations that we find ourselves in is about as large as that of personality traits. Okay, so we can say that our behavior is half the situations that we find ourselves in and half our personality. However, it is also true that across many different situations, general tendencies do emerge. And therefore, personality traits indicate how people will act on average. Okay, so they're not so great at predicting behavior in a specific situation, but because people tend to be mostly consistent and that there's general tendencies, we can say that personality traits kind of give us a starting place as a way to indicate how people will act kind of on average or overall across many different situations, even if it doesn't help us predict with a lot of precision how they'll behave in a particular situation. Okay, so therefore, to really think about how to capture broad personality traits, we have to look at how people perform and behave over time and across many different types of situations. So this is to say that somebody who is a very extroverted person and who is very talkative, we wouldn't expect them to be very talkative at a situation where people usually don't talk. So sitting in a church service, for example, most people don't talk. But in other situations, like at an informal gathering of friends, we might expect that somebody who is more talkative might be the person that talks the most. Okay? Or looking at in the classroom, people that are more inclined to raise their hand versus not. So what a broad trait will tell us is looking across all these different situations. Certainly, being in a strong situation like a church service, we don't expect an extrovert to be talkative. But looking across a variety of situations, somebody that scores higher in extroversion is bound to be more talkative on average across all of those situations than somebody that is not. For those of you that would like to find out more about your personality, I'd encourage you to take one of the assessments below. These are free, and they're assessments of the big five personality model. So you can get a better sense for the model as well as how psychologists measure personality by taking one of these inventories.